Topic for today is callings. Can I ask to be released from my calling? And the short answer is yes. And so for those who are not familiar with how callings work, I wanted to talk about it for a second because there's a lot of tradition and false conceptions of callings that especially I grew up with. Like I heard a few of these as I was growing up. So for somebody who's new to the church, callings can be easily misconstrued because you'll walk into a sacrament meeting and they'll say, if so-and-so is here today, would they please stand up? And they stand up like, we propose that he or she is going to be given this calling, all in favor. And everybody raises their hand. And if you don't know anybody, you might think that they're like randomly chosen, spur of the moment. And that's not how it's done. I mean, with rare exception, that might be the case. But most of the time, the vast majority of the time, people are given plenty of notice of their calling. Days, weeks, whatever. They're told, hey, we would like to extend this calling to you to serve in the ward or stake or whatever in this function. Would you be willing to serve in that capacity? And they say yes or no or whatever. And if they say yes, then they say, okay, we'll sustain you this coming Sunday. And then that's when they call the name, the person stands up so they're aware of what's going on. And the callings are really just an assignment. There is kind of a difference between a calling and an assignment, but that's not really important. But callings are you being asked to fulfill a need in the unit, whatever unit you're being asked to serve in. And there's traditions of how callings are made and how you're supposed to respond to them and how you're supposed to serve in them. So I'll give you kind of the misrepresentation that I grew up with. Not that this was like, formally presented to me, but it was suggested and said in different ways. So the tradition in the culture is that whoever is giving the calling, whoever's extending the calling, like let's say a bishop, the bishop prays and says, I have this need in my ward, who can fill this need? And then a voice from heaven comes down and says, it's going to be Mr. Smith. And he says, oh, thank you so much. And he calls Mr. Smith in and says, the Lord has asked me to give you this calling. And Mr. Smith is required to say yes. And no is not really an option. And then he's sustained, and then he is to serve in that calling until he is released. And he is not to question or doubt the calling or ask to be released or anything like that. He's just supposed to do it. And if he's in that calling for 2 weeks, so be it. And if he's in that calling for 20 years, so be it. It's not up to him. So that's kind of the tradition that's been developed out of, historical tradition and assumption and all kinds of different stuff. That's not the way it works. The way it works in practice, and in my belief, the way that it should work, is much more of a working together to figure out how to solve problems. So the bishop has a need, and the bishop will, if he's a good bishop, he's going to be praying about it. He's going to be praying about how to solve for the needs in his unit as guided by the Spirit. And oftentimes that does involve names coming to his mind. Wow, clearing my throat a lot. Sorry about that. So yeah, in my case, I'll often have names come to my mind of who I think would be appropriate or good, and usually there would be some kind of label attached to that, or maybe like a group. So this is like a group of names that would obviously be really strong in that calling. Here's a group of names that may not be as strong, but they probably need to be in that calling, like to have that experience. Here's a group of names that it would be good for them to have that opportunity because they need, a growth opportunity. Or here's a group of names of people who just aren't doing anything, and so we should consider them just so that they have something to do. And then as you're praying, you're kind of filtering through the names and crossing some off and highlighting some and just trying to figure out which person might be best suited for the role. So then the bishop or whoever would come to the decision, and he's consulting with his counselors, just like he's told to in the handbook and so forth. And they decide, and in that decision, there's all kinds of factors. Very rarely, it does happen, but very rarely is it like, oh, that's the name, and we have no idea why Mr. Smith is going to be the one to serve in that calling. That's just the name that came to us. Like that, it does happen. It's just not very common. And so there is typically a lot more consulting that goes on when trying to figure out what callings are going to work for people. So then the bishop will sit down with the individual and say, Mr. Smith, we'd like to call you to this calling. And Mr. Smith, the person being called, does not necessarily have no choice in the matter, and it's not a shameful thing to say no to a calling. It is hard because we do want to serve, and we do believe that these callings do come through a lot of consideration and inspiration. And so when you say no to a calling, you don't do it lightly. And you don't do it for no reason. If you're doubting whether or not you should be taking the calling, then you should go home and pray about it and really see if that's something that is going to be good for you. In my experience, if I feel like I'm not fit for a calling or I don't want the calling, I will typically say yes with a big asterisk and say, I will try it out. That's like the closest I've ever come to saying no. I've said no to assignments, but I haven't said no to a calling yet. But I have said I'll try it out. And I'll usually give it like a month or two to see if that's something that I'm going to be able to manage, either like work-life balance, time, resources, training, abilities, interests, different things like that to be considered. And then lastly, when you're in the calling, it's important to know that you have options. You have options to consider different ways of doing it, and I've been thinking a lot about how to help people think outside the box when they're in a calling, because that has been so helpful to me in a calling to just, what should this look like? Like, if I was going to invent this assignment from scratch, what would I want it to look like? And that's been so helpful and rewarding to get rid of all of the tradition and just kind of start from scratch. But I think where people get hung up the most is in this idea that we cannot ask to be released from a calling. That if we do, we're betraying, God's calling for us. Like, we're betraying the inspiration that the bishop received, or something like that. And that might be the case in some cases. Most of the time, that's not anywhere near the truth. Most of the time, unfortunately, you get put in a calling, and after you're put in the calling, the bishop doesn't really think about it. The leadership doesn't really think about it regularly. I mean, every once in a while, they'll kind of go through the list in their head, like, oh wow, so-and-so's been in that calling for 5 years, and then they'll be like, yeah, we should probably release him. Well, you probably should have released him like 2 years ago. It just took you 2 years to think about how long they've been in a calling. And so if the bishop was on his game, he would be going through each calling, once a year or something like that. He'd be going through each calling, each person, and praying about whether or not, that he needs to bring him in to talk about whether or not they should be released or whatever. But most bishops don't do that. They just don't think about it or whatever. And so if you've been in a calling and you don't feel like it's appropriate, I would highly encourage you to go talk to the bishop about it before you get to some kind of resentful, bitter place of like, I need to be released now, or I need to be released or else. That's a really frustrating place to be in. And so please go talk to the bishop before you get to that point. Because there's no reason why you can't have a say in what calling you have. And I know people who have done that, who've been in a calling for a long time, and they'll start complaining to their spouse or a friend and saying like, yeah, I've been doing this for 10 years and I just feel stuck. I'm not a part of things, or I don't like being in front of people, and whatever the thing is. And it's like, yeah, you should probably just go and ask to be given a different assignment. But they feel like they're betraying the ward or being selfish in different ways. So I'm giving you permission to go talk to the bishop if you're ever in that situation, because it's easily sorted out. And in my experience, most of the time, the leadership is like, oh, I had no idea that you were feeling frustrated, or I had no idea that you have been in the calling for a long time, or I had no idea that you don't enjoy this, and so we can do things differently. So the whole process is much more organic and down to earth than what tradition would suggest, which I think is a good thing. And I believe, and I've had some experience with upper leadership doing the same kind of thing. I believe that the prophet himself and the apostles and the 70s and the stake presidents and the patriarchs and everybody does this same revelatory process, where you pray about something and you work through it, kind of grassroots, and trying to solve the problems with God. And that is revelation. Revelation rarely has zero context. Revelation rarely has zero prompting, zero questions. It's most often that revelation is based on the studying or thoughtful processing of whatever's going on. So that's callings in a nutshell, and hopefully that helps. We'll see you next time.